Perched on the southernmost tip of Maryland's western shore, where the Chesapeake Bay opens into the Potomac River, Point Lookout Lighthouse is a compact, unpretentious structure with an outsized story. Its white square keeper's house capped by a small lantern marks a landform that has been a crossroads of maritime navigation, war, suffering, and memory for nearly 2 centuries. This essay traces the lighthouse's origins and architecture, the human dramas, from shipwrecks to Civil War prisons, that imprinted the place with trauma, and the folklore and paranormal investigations that have made Point Lookout one of the East Coast's most frequently discussed, haunted lighthouses. Point Lookout occupies a thin peninsula in St. Mary's County, Maryland, that projects south between the Chesapeake Bay to the east and the Potomac River to the west. Because it sits at the mouth of the Potomac, it controls, figuratively at least, the immediate approaches to the river and the ports upriver. Shifting shoals, tidal currents, and the sheer traffic of vessels traveling between river and bay made the area hazardous in the age of sail and early steam. Mariners and local authorities therefore viewed a light at Point Lookout as essential to safe navigation, particularly for ships heading toward Alexandria, Washington, and other Potomac ports. The lighthouse's location also made the peninsula militarily useful during wars. It offered a vantage point over 2 important waterways. Point Lookout Light was first commissioned in 1830. The original structure was a modest keeper's dwelling with a lantern placed on the roof, a common economical lighthouse type of that period. John Donahue, a prolific Maryland lighthouse builder, is credited with constructing the original light for an appropriation that records show was small by later standards. The initial tower dwelling measured roughly 1.5 stories and produced a navigational aid intended to warn mariners of the shoals and the confluence of currents where the Potomac met the bay. Over the 19th century, the structure was altered to meet changing needs. In 1872, a fog bell was added for low visibility conditions, later removed when it proved ineffective in context. And in 1883, the building was expanded to a full 2 stories, while the light's focal plane was raised to increase visibility. The lighthouse's characteristic lens was a 4th-order Fresnel lens during its active life, and the light guided traffic into the Potomac for well over a century before being decommissioned in the mid-20th century. Documented remodels in 1873 to 1883 and again in the 1920s stabilized the structure and made it the recognizable keeper's house with lantern shape we see today. If there is a single historical episode that has most shaped Point Lookout's reputation, it is the Civil War. Beginning in 1862 to 1863, the peninsula was transformed by the Union Army into an enormous, often lethal, medical and penitentiary complex. Hammond General Hospital, a sprawling field hospital, was built to treat Union soldiers, and soon after the Battle of Gettysburg and other campaigns, Confederate prisoners began to arrive and be held at Camp Hoffman on the peninsula. At the height of operations, tens of thousands of prisoners passed through Point Lookout. Overcrowding, exposure, inadequate shelter, and disease devastated the camp population. Contemporary and modern estimates place the number of prisoners who passed through and were housed at the point in the tens of thousands, and the documented death toll is substantial. Nearly 4,000 Confederate prisoners died there between 1863 and 1865 from disease, exposure, and other causes associated with the impossible conditions. Several features of this episode are relevant to the lighthouse's later haunted reputation. First, the camp established Point Lookout as a place of mass death on a scale that was readily remembered by locals. Second, the presence of multiple cemeteries, separate burial areas for prisoners and for Union dead, and the later relocation or reburial of remains have produced narratives about unaccounted graves and restless spirits. Third, the hospital functions, with their dying, amputations, and desperate medical improvisation, leave strong cultural echoes that feed ghost stories and somber interpretation. The park today preserves museum exhibits and a Confederate cemetery marker as part of an effort to remember this history responsibly. Because the point sits where the bay and Potomac meet, it has long been associated with shipwrecks and maritime accidents. Historical records, local newspapers, and keeper diaries record numerous grounded or wrecked vessels, storm-driven losses, and small boat drownings in the waters nearby. Keepers' rescue work, launching boats, ferrying injured sailors to shore, and salvaging wreckage was part of daily life in a dangerous stretch of water. Some of the most personal tragedies recorded in the town and keeper histories involve individual keepers or their families. For example, newspaper and genealogical summaries note incidents like the death of Harry Monsell, whose body was found at Point Lookout in 1918 after going missing from another duty station, as well as other drownings and accidents tied to the maritime economy. These incidents, when later recounted without context, can take on mythic weight and become entangled with stories of haunting. A few keeper-related narratives recur in both historical record and legend. The Davis family served for generations at Point Lookout, and family lore notes that after James Davis's death, his daughter Anne continued duties in some capacity. Local accounts and oral histories recall tragedies and the hardships of family life at a remote light station, illness, early death of children, and storms, which later readers often frame as eerie or suggestive of restless spirits. Local memorials and family histories preserve fragments of these stories. Harry Monsell. His drowning and the discovery of his body at Point Lookout are attested in regional newspapers. Such deaths were common enough on the Chesapeake that they were headline material for local press. Over the decades, these sorts of incidents have been retold by storytellers who link them to ghost sightings at the lighthouse. It's important to stress that while individual deaths were tragic, the direct, contemporaneous evidence linking a particular death to posthumous hauntings is anecdotal and retrospective. Memories and oral accounts decades later often reinterpret mundane or unexplained noises as proof of ghosts. Even when the Chesapeake Bay lies calm under the summer sun, Point Lookout exudes a sense of waiting, the subtle, eerie stillness that seems to hum just beneath the wind. Locals, park rangers, and visitors alike often describe it as a place where the past lingers in the corners, in the rustle of grasses, and in the creak of old wooden stairs. The lighthouse itself, squat and unassuming, seems to hold a quiet tension. The tiny lantern room perched atop the keeper's house watches the confluence of Potomac and Bay, and in the darkness, many have felt that something watches back. The first reports of the lighthouse's ghostly activity date to the late 19th century, when keepers' journals describe noises that could not be attributed to storms, tides, or wildlife. One early keeper, Thomas Willard, wrote in 1893 of hearing footsteps pacing the halls at night, long after his family had gone to bed. He noted, "It is as if a second figure moves in the house with me, following each turn, yet never seen when I look directly." Willard's entries, preserved in the Maryland Historical Society archives, suggest unease but also devotion to duty. He continued to light the lantern every night, even as the sounds grew more insistent. By the mid-20th century, as the lighthouse stood largely abandoned, stories of strange phenomena became more elaborate. Local fishermen would tell of lights bobbing along the shoreline, lantern-like glows drifting across the marshes, where the old Confederate cemetery lay. Some swore the lights mimicked those of lost ships, or the lanterns once carried by soldiers tending sick prisoners in the Civil War hospital. The stories blurred the line between maritime warning and spectral echo. Sailors spoke of being drawn toward the light only to find empty marshes, or of hearing faint cries mingling with the wind off the Potomac. Visitors in the 1970s and 1980s reported similar experiences inside the lighthouse itself. One caretaker recalled a stormy night when she was performing routine maintenance. "I was checking the lens," she said in an oral history interview, "when I felt a chill that didn't belong to the air. Then I heard a low moan, not human, not wind. I turned quickly, and there was nothing, only the shadow of the staircase stretching long across the floor." Such accounts, while unverifiable, echo earlier keepers' journals and suggest that the building's architecture, its narrow hallways, steep stairs, and enclosed lantern room, amplifies human perception and imagination, particularly when layered atop decades of human tragedy. The Civil War history of the peninsula provides a foundation for many ghost stories. Camp Hoffman, the prison complex, and Hammond General Hospital were sites of suffering on a massive scale. Thousands of Confederate prisoners endured overcrowding, disease, and exposure. Thousands more Union soldiers passed through the hospital wards, often dying from battle wounds and illnesses. Modern visitors sometimes report hearing muffled footsteps in the grass near the old cemeteries or fleeting figures glimpsed in the corner of the eye. Events described as if the past itself rises to touch the present. Ghost hunters, amateur and professional alike, often interpret these phenomena as echoes of those who lived and died here. Perhaps the most compelling modern stories involve a few well-documented sightings. One evening in 1987, a small team of paranormal investigators set up audio recording equipment in the lighthouse. As the wind howled around the structure, they reported hearing what sounded like the dragging of chains across the wooden floor. On playback, a low, sorrowful voice whispers something almost recognizable. "Help me." Whether spirit, suggestion, or auditory illusion, the incident entered local lore and remains one of the most cited modern hauntings. The lighthouse is not haunted in the uniform way one might expect from a Gothic novel. The experiences vary: sudden drops in temperature in the keeper's room, fleeting apparitions of Civil War soldiers on the lawn, the sense of unseen footsteps on the lantern stairs. These phenomena are often subtle: a cold spot, a whisper, a flicker of light. Yet together they create a tapestry of suspense and mystery. For some visitors, the stories are thrilling. For others, haunting. For all, they offer a bridge to the past, a reminder of lives lived and lost on a narrow strip of land where land and sea meet. What makes Point Lookout's haunting so enduring is the layering of history and imagination. Each ghost story, each inexplicable noise or chill, draws upon real events: the hospital wards, the prison camp, the shipwrecks, the lonely vigil of the keepers. They are stories of service, suffering, and the tenuousness of life on the water's edge. In the silence between the tides, the lighthouse stands as witness, a sentinel not only for the living mariner, but for memories that refuse to fade entirely. Walking the lighthouse grounds at dusk, one can feel the weight of those stories. The marshes shimmer under fading light, and the air carries both brine and memory. Some say, if you listen closely, you might hear the lantern turning on its own, the soft echo of long-dead footsteps, or the distant murmur of voices from the hospitals and prison camps that once dominated the point. Whether spectral or imagined, these experiences remind visitors that history is not only something to read about in books. At Point Lookout, it can be felt, heard, and sometimes glimpsed just beyond the edge of vision. Point Lookout's ghostly reputation has both helped and complicated preservation. On one hand, paranormal tourism, organized nighttime investigations, ghost tours, and media episodes raises public interest and can generate funds or volunteer energy. On the other hand, sensationalist portrayals risk overshadowing the actual historical record, especially the story of imprisoned men who died in the Civil War. and can invite vandalism or disrespect at sensitive sites like cemeteries. Local organisations have attempted to strike a balance. The Preservation Society runs educational events and limited paranormal programs, but it also emphasises historical interpretation, respectful remembrance of the dead, and careful conservation of fragile fabric. Maryland DNR exhibits at the Lighthouse and the Park's Museum foreground, the Civil War Hospital and prisoner history, anchoring the site's meaning in accountable history rather than purely in spectacle. Ghost stories at places like Point Lookout operate as cultural shorthand for unresolved grief, suppressed histories, and the haunting quality of public trauma. When thousands die in a small space and remain in local memory, it is unsurprising that later generations use haunting metaphors to make sense of that past. Ghost narratives can function usefully by directing attention to otherwise neglected histories. For instance, the suffering of Confederate prisoners, the medical history of Civil War care, or the environmental toll of shoreline living. But they can also distort by simplifying or sensationalizing. Ethically, stewards of historic sites carry a responsibility to foreground factual history while allowing space for folklore. At Point Lookout, that responsibility has meant preserving cemeteries, curating exhibits that report the scale of wartime suffering, and controlling access, so the integrity of the site and the dignity of those buried there are not compromised for thrill-seeking. Point Lookout's survival is testimony to local activism, state support, and careful stewardship. The lighthouse now functions as an interpretive museum piece within Point Lookout State Park, drawing visitors who come for history, nature, and yes, sometimes ghost stories. The restoration work completed in the 2010s and early 2020s, and the lighthouse's reopening to wider visitation in 2025, demonstrate the ongoing public value assigned to the place. Continued challenges include managing visitor impact, funding continued conservation in a harsh marine environment, and balancing the competing demands of heritage tourism and respectful commemoration. Point Lookout Lighthouse did what lights were always meant to do. It marked danger and guided mariners. But history layered onto that simple function in ways that no beam could fully dispel. The peninsula's Civil War hospitals and prison compounds, the shipwrecks and drownings, and the personal tragedies of keepers and families have produced a place where memory and imagination intersect. Whether or not one accepts the literal reality of ghosts, the psychological and cultural haunting of Point Lookout is real. It compels visitors to reckon with human suffering, to ask how we remember the dead, and to consider how a modest white house with a lantern on its roof can become an emblem of both maritime service and human loss. Preservation efforts, responsible interpretation, and community engagement have transformed the lighthouse from a decaying curiosity into an accessible learning place. Those who visit now can see carefully curated exhibits about keeper life, the wartime hospital, and the prison camp. They can also walk the shore and think about why places of trauma attract the stories they do. If anything, the lighthouse's most important function today is not only to point to hazards at sea, but to point visitors back into history, towards stories that deserve careful, respectful attention rather than cheap thrills.